Welcome everyone to our first spring colloquium. Yes, this is our first colloquium of the spring quarter. We are so glad to have you here with us. I'm going to turn over to Relina to introduce our speaker in a minute here, but first I want to begin this event with a land acknowledgement. The University of Washington acknowledges the Coast Salish peoples of this land, the land which touches the shared waters of all tribes and bands within the Suquamish, Tulalip, and Muckleshoot nations. Now, without further ado, although I'm sure you all know her and love her, I am going to introduce you to Dr. Relina Joseph. Relina is the Presidential Term Professor of Communication and Adjunct Professor of American Ethnic Studies and Gender, Women, and Sexuality Studies at the University of Washington, Seattle. She is also the founding and acting director of our department's Center for Communication, Difference, and Equity, and creator of the Interrupting Privilege program. Finally, you might also find Relina working as Associate Dean of Equity and Justice in graduate programs at the University of Washington's Graduate School. Now, without further ado, Relina, I'd like you to introduce our speaker.
Thank you. Thanks so much. Thank you all for coming here today. And it is my incredible pleasure to welcome Dr. Jennifer McClearen to our departmental colloquium series on race and media. Dr. McClearen will be sharing some of her first book, and I do say first book because I believe there will be many to come here. And that's called Fighting Visibility. And her talk today is going to share a portion of that specifically on unpaid, gendered, and racialized labor for the UFC. So I've known Dr. McClearen for a decade now. She began her MA PhD work in our department in the fall of 2011, although I remember her introducing herself to me at NCA, at an NCA reception that was in the fall before our grad admission. So anyone thinking about graduate school, definitely do that. It was a bold move and it paid off. And I had the good fortune to advise her. So for all of you graduate students out there who are listening along, Jennifer was an ideal student. She was the type of student who prepared meticulously for classes and carefully considered every word of advice given to her, not only by her professors, but by fellow graduate students and by the undergraduates that she taught. And in fact, to this day, if I suggest a book or an article to Jen, she'll come back having read it and also with other suggestions for other things to read. She's that type of a scholar, that type of an intellect, and just that type of a really thoughtful individual. Dr. McClearen was also the first graduate student with whom I shared unpublished work. And at that point, it was 12 years or so into me being a professor. I had done some work on audience studies. And after I had written it, I thought, who do I want to be my first reader here? And it wasn't any of my faculty colleagues, it was Jen. And at that moment, it was very clear to me that as a graduate student, she had become my colleague. And that to me is just this incredible transition that usually doesn't happen until someone graduates. It happened many years before Jennifer actually graduated. And now she is an assistant professor in her dream job of media studies in the Department of Radio, Television, Film at the University of Texas in Austin, where she's also affiliated faculty with the Center for Sports Communication and Media and the Center for Entertainment and Media Industries. She's a feminist media scholar who examines the cultural production of different and popular media with a focus on sports and consumer culture. She probes the ways in which sports media defines, perpetuates, or contests discourses of gender, of race, of sexuality, and nationality through the lenses of feminist theory, cultural studies, and humanistic media studies. Her research can be found in Communication and Sport, Feminist Media Studies, International Journal of Communication, and of course in her brand new book, Fighting Visibility. Please join me in welcoming home Dr. Jennifer McClearen.
Well, thank you so much for that. I don't know how I'm actually supposed to start talking after you give me that kind of introduction. I'm a little choked up already, and I just started. So thank you for that, Relina. No, but seriously, thank you so much for inviting me. It's really nice to do. This is actually my first official book talk. We had a book launch, but this is my first official book talk, and the book was officially released yesterday. So I feel really, it's very ceremonial for me that I'm giving this talk here with you. And I also wanted to say thank you so much for coming. I know it's the beginning of your quarter, and I do remember what quarters were like. So I appreciate you being here and coming to listen to what I have to say today. So thank you. And thanks for everybody that worked to bring me here. So Relina, Leilani, Andrea, Christine, and also Megan and Anu for their efforts in publicizing and coordinating this. So I really appreciate everyone for doing that. So I'm going to share my screen and get us started. Let's make sure I share the right one. All right. Okay, so what I'm going to do for us today is do the general book talk sort of thing, in that I'm going to start with an overview of the arguments that I'm making in the book, what I cover in the book overall. I'll give a little bit of hint of what the book was like when it was a dissertation. And then I'm going to focus a bit more on the labor of visibility on social media, in particular, the ways that labor is gendered and racialized. And then I'll offer some conclusions that kind of sum up the whole book while integrating also the specific chapter on the labor of visibility. Okay, so book overview. Fighting Visibility examines the incorporation of female fighters into the Ultimate Fighting Championship, which is the world's largest mixed martial arts promotion. For the first 20 years of the promotion's existence, the UFC said, never, 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 we're never going to include female athletes on our rosters. Then Ronda Rousey began winning fights in spectacular fashion in another promotion, and the UFC suddenly realized a couple of things. One, female athletes were actually very skilled and entertaining fighters. I know, it's shocking. And two, there was an audience ready and willing to watch women fight. The promotion announced its women's division with Rousey as the crown jewel in late 2012, and she helped explode the UFC's popularity with more mainstream audiences. While in a lot of ways we might look at this phenomenon and say, wow, the UFC is increasing the visibility of women in combat sports by a huge margin, this is really impressive considering the abysmal coverage of women's sports overall. But the heart of this book really moves beyond even the UFC to think about what representation actually achieves in media culture. Sorry, I just want to switch my view just a little bit so I can see everything at once. Okay, now we're moving. Fighting Visibility urges those of us who are already invested in women's sports, and I define that as scholars, activists, fans, and journalists, to critically examine the cultural beliefs around representation matters, or if she can see it, she can be it. What we often claim as representational victories for female athletes are actually co-opted by corporate interests that further disenfranchise female athletes. The UFC capitalizes on the fact that they have diverse female athletes on their rosters while exploiting the labor of those same athlete workers. Some of the most disenfranchised are women of color, lesbians, and gender nonconforming women, because although they are represented to some degree or another, structural issues ensure they remain marginalized. At the end of the day, the book bursts the mirage in progressive discourse around sports that representation mattering is unilaterally beneficial for female athletes. Instead, representation can be the very thing that's used to exploit them. And so to give you a little bit of background of where this book was when it was actually a dissertation, I started it when I started training Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu I started training around 2012. And that was about the time that there was some interest in bringing women into the UFC. And at that time, I started watching the UFC with my training partners because people were interested in the sport of MMA. Jiu-Jitsu and MMA are different, but there's some elements that are certainly similar within the sports. And I was very skeptical about this thing called the UFC. I totally bought the stereotype of the sort of meathead, hypermasculine man. And I turned up my nose at it at first. But as I started watching it with my training partners, I developed a little bit more of a respect for it as an actual sport. And at that time, they also brought in Ronda Rousey. And I was very skeptical at first at how they were going to treat her. But then her popularity exploded. And all of this was happening around the time that I needed to figure out what I was going to write about my dissertation. So it was a sort of a perfect marriage of opportunity, I guess. And if you had asked me when I started grad school if I was going to eventually become an expert in sports media and that I would be hired by an R1 institution to be that expert, I would have laughed, because that wasn't really where I thought my career was going. But this is the great thing about research. It takes you in directions that you wouldn't necessarily have intended. So the questions that I started with the dissertation is, how did this hypermasculine meathead brand get into the business of women's empowerment, and how were they able to make female athletes so popular? So my questions really revolved around branding and marketing. Throughout the book, I use the term branded difference to describe the marketing and branding strategies the UFC utilizes to make diverse fighters visible in the UFC. I further theorize the term as a discourse that presumes that the visibility of difference, including gender, race, sexuality, ethnicity, and nationality, will lead to success in the ring and a stable livelihood for fighters. This presumption inspires fighters to work for the promotion, even though there is limited return on the literal blood, sweat, and tears that visibility requires, while the UFC remains the primary benefactor of that labor. At the same time, branded difference celebrates the presence and meaningful representation of diverse female fighters in the promotion, while serving as a distraction that deflects attention away from the ways that visibility can also hurt those same fighters. As a result, the visibility that branded difference in the UFC facilitates is a culturally and economically problematic brand strategy rather than a unilateral victory for sportswomen. In contrast to critical race and feminist understandings of difference, specifically in the ways that Relina Joseph has theorized difference, the UFC's brand identity depicts all fighters as possessing some form of difference, this idea that we are all different in some way. This definition equates the queer Black female fighter's experience of being different with a straight white man's. In this logic, he is different because maybe he's dyslexic, he's struggled in school, while she is different because her gender, race, and sexuality are in common in the promotion. Both fighters' differences are recognized and understood as creating challenges in life, which makes the UFC seem inclusive on the surface. Branded difference finds kindred spirits in Kristen Warner's concept of plastic representation and Mary Beltran's articulation of meaningful diversity. Beltran describes meaningful diversity as a media text that includes fully realized minoritized characters, writers who are knowledgeable of perspectives of non-white characters, and diversity as naturally occurring in the setting. Warner questions the neoliberal impulse to include diverse bodies on screen without providing the depth and nuance that meaningful diversity offers. She uses plasticity as a metaphor to critically examine the present push for a quantifiable number of Black identities in media and the simultaneous assumption that the mere presence of Black actors breeds societal change. Warner shows how media executives sometimes inorganically plug and play Black actors as a means for achieving some sort of assumed parity, while Beltran imagines how meaningful diversity can take shape in media culture. So I position branded difference as extension of these ideas that actually describe the strategic communication efforts by the UFC brand to lure audiences and fighters through either meaningful or plastic representations of a variety of identities. The luminosity of branded difference supports the ideological effect of masking inequalities produced when difference glistens in brand culture. In particular, branded difference is a glossy artifice that sits atop labor exploitation. So when I'm talking about labor exploitation here, there's a few things that I want to emphasize. So on the surface, female fighters are depicted as breaking barriers, as being empowered symbols. And this doesn't mean, just because they're a symbol of empowerment, doesn't mean that they actually have agency in their work. And in fact, they might be disenfranchised workers. And I think that they are. UFC fighters are independent contractors, which means they don't have year-round health insurance, retirement benefits, or guaranteed income. In a profession where you literally put your body on the line, this is a highly problematic way of recruiting fighters, considering that most fighters are underpaid and the UFC is worth billions. And I do mean billions. Most sources say that there's roughly 10 to 20% of the UFC's revenue goes towards fighters. Whereas if you look at leagues like the NFL or the NBA, it's about a 50-50 split in terms of revenue. And then most of the revenue within the UFC is heavily weighted towards stars, so that people that are actually at the mid-tier or lower tier, which is the vast majority of fighters, aren't really making very much at all. The UFC doesn't disclose fighter pay currently. This might change soon, and we can talk about that in Q&A if you're curious, but there's some evidence that suggests that women's wages are lower than men's at a rate comparable to other sectors in society in terms of gender and race, and perhaps even worse. So on top of this, as independent contractors, fighters pay practically all training and preparation expenses out of pocket when they win. So they have to pay a certain margin to managers, to their coaches and trainers, to the amount of money that goes into conditioning and then also recovering from fights. And then if they want to have insurance year round, they're going to have to pay for that. So all the fringe benefits they're having to pay on their own, and then pay a lot out for just training for fights. So the salaries that you actually, or not the salaries, but the payouts you actually see are not as lucrative as they look on the surface. In this book, I examine the UFC through the circuit of culture. It's a cultural studies model that examines the interrelationships between production, consumption, regulation, identity, and representation in order to consider how the visibility of female fighters circulates and at what cost. Each of these aspects in the circuit are connected, yet also contextual to particular moments in time, geographical locations, or type of media endeavor. To get a little bit more specific, I analyzed hundreds of interviews with fighters and employees. Most of these came from MMA websites and also brand and business analysis sites like Adweek or Forbes. I interviewed 9 current or former UFC fighters and 7 current or former UFC employees. I used textual analysis to look specifically at the media representations. So in cultural studies, all of these various modes of collecting information ultimately become read as discourse that I seek to unpack and examine as it relates to relations of power. If I were a social scientist, I would throw around words like mixed methods, triangulated, a social scientist, so I won't, but just know that there is some affinities in terms of those types of research strategies. I'm also a feminist media scholar, so that means that subjectivity and identity are very central to how I read and analyze discourse. And as a feminist media scholar, I have to put that out front, in front of my analysis, in order to show you how the particular lenses that I read from impact the interpretation that I have. And so I am a queer white woman. I have practiced martial arts for about 15 years. And I have an intimate knowledge of gender discrimination in martial arts, even though my experiences are obviously very different from female fighters in a profession. But I also have, because Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu is so connected to mixed martial arts, some of the people that I interviewed were in my personal networks because of the connections between those things. So I'm both an insider and outsider examining the sport with the critical eye of a scholar, the embodied knowledge of a queer cisgender martial arts practitioner, and the curiosity of an MMA fan. So now I'm going to switch over to talking about the specific chapter I wanted to present today. This is chapter 4, called The Labor of Visibility on Social Media. So this chapter in particular examines the promises and pitfalls of using social media to promote their brands as athletes. So how female fighters do this. I argued that the labor of visibility online is a hidden and undercompensated aspect of a UFC fighter's job that primarily benefits the promotion and excises a specific gendered and racialized labor for female fighters. Making oneself visible online is work that often rests squarely on the fighters themselves, because the UFC encourages them to be active on social media until they have theoretically made it, at which time the UFC presumably increases their own promotional labor to augment a fighter's star power. Fighters must work at their own visibility online. They perform that labor while hoping to generate enough interest to convince the UFC that they're a viable investment and or to gain attention from potential sponsors. And this is particularly important when you're an independent contractor and you're not guaranteed necessarily your fights. And then also you aren't making very much money, so you need sponsors. Media scholar Brooke Aaron Duffy offers insight into the cultural logics that motivate many UFC fighters to labor online with little to no reward. Duffy coined the term aspirational labor to describe a, quote, mode of mostly uncompensated independent work on social media that is propelled by the much venerated idea of getting paid to do what you love. So UFC fighters don't necessarily love promoting themselves online, but they see it as a necessity in order to gain the attention that they need in order to increase their livelihood and increase their opportunity in the promotion. Social media is a means to an end. It is the thing they believe that will get them into the octagon frequently enough to do what they love. Much of the content fighters generate online is unpaid or underpaid, but the promises of visibility in the UFC suggest that it will eventually pay off through material rewards or social capital, because branded difference is presumed to work as a strategy. Yet, as with the content creators that Duffy studies, someone is benefiting now from the labor of fighters. Social media platforms themselves make money from the content posted through advertising revenue, and the UFC can identify potential stars based on a fighter's popularity on social media, and they do monitor fighters' social media accounts so that they can see how that popularity is working for them. If fighters generate significant followers, clicks, likes, and comments, then the UFC often takes notice, schedules them to fight, and may potentially spend additional resources in that fighter's promotion via more mainstream, that is, more visible and lucrative media channels. All the while, the more fighters hashtag the UFC and generate content with the promotion's name attached, the more the UFC can justify the brand's worth to sponsors and partners. In the end, the labor of visibility in the UFC is a pyramid scheme, bolstered by the success of a few fighters who have gained celebrity status online and become millionaires in the sports. So this pyramid scheme also works better for pretty white women than other women. And that's what I am going to talk about next. In just a minute, I have another thing to say before I get to that. The unwritten bullet point on the job description of UFC fighter is, quote, grow your fan base online and by gaining followers and interacting with them on a regular basis. That implicit job requirement aligns with broader culture that assumes that everyone should be self-promoting. And you know, I think scholars and grad students and undergrads all sort of feel this pressure to self-promote. Have your own website, have your own Twitter, make sure you get your brand out there. As Alison Hearn writes, the function of the brand itself is purely rhetorical. Its goal is to produce cultural value and potentially material profit. I would also posit that this transferring of responsibility from the marketing professional to the individual person becomes even more pronounced in a work climate that hires independent contractors instead of employees. So one of the things that I asked all the fighters that I interviewed myself, and one of the things that I dug through a lot of their other interviews that were given across various media platforms, was what is the central component of the MMA profession outside training and actually fighting? And they all talked about social media as being something that they should do in order to gain visibility or sponsors or attention from the UFC. Some of them embraced this as part of their job. Some of them were more ambivalent, and some of them were downright reluctant because they didn't like putting themselves out there on social media. For independent contractors like UFC fighters, companies and institutions avoid viewing themselves as responsible for paying benefits or supporting the contractor beyond the job they've agreed to do. So they invest fewer other resources to help them excel at their job. Gina Neff describes this risk economy as a contemporary labor discourse where the risks of employment shift from company to the individual. And this is why gig labor is so popular, and Uber doesn't or hasn't in the past had to pay fringe benefits or guaranteed work for their employees. It's a very lucrative type of model that a lot of different sectors are getting into. In an age of media saturation where anyone can become a micro celebrity on Instagram, presumably, these female fighters understand that curating a hyper-feminine heterosexual image on social media can lead to opportunities for visibility in the UFC, as well as additional income and other advantages, such as free stuff through sponsorships. A lot of the female fighters that I spoke with compared themselves to Paige Van Zandt, who is a fighter that has a very bubbly personality. She's blonde, she's pretty, she's very charismatic on Instagram. She seems like an Instagram type model. And they often compared themselves to her as like what she was able to do with her specific performance of femininity versus what they were able to do. And many of the fighters I spoke with felt authentic if they tried to curate an online presence that caters to a conventionally straight male gaze, even though they also knew that it was potentially lucrative for some of them. Instead, they attempted to be themselves and post content that will attract more niche audiences of online followers. The structure of social media sites like Instagram allow these women to develop a certain level of visibility within representational culture, even if the rewards are unequal to those that accrue for women who perform femininity online that aligns with ideals of white femininity, like Paige Van Zandt. Scholars Kim Tofoletti and Holly Thorpe find that the most visible sportswomen online excel in a form of labor called the athletic labor of femininity, or a quote, non-sporting labor that female athletes undertake to demonstrate successful sporting subjectivity online relative to post-feminist aesthetic and effective codes of femininity as they are presented through the body. So in other words, the sportswomen that Tofoletti and Thorpe examine, like Serena Williams and Ronda Rousey, perform a delicate dance between femininity and athleticism while positioning themselves as women with agency and choice, which are characteristics of the post-feminist aesthetic. The athletic labor of femininity translates into a viable income for female athletes that can adopt a pretty powerful and empowering image. These women stereotypically appeal to straight men through their heterosexiness and straight women for their power and strength. So with the athletic labor of femininity, I also find this to be a racialized discourse because the athletic labor of femininity also impacts how women of color navigate social media and self-branding. Popular feminist media has championed Rousey, for example, for being unabashed and unashamed of embracing her muscular athletic body, while at the same time, US and international media have long criticized Williams for being too muscular. Sexist and racist discourses about her body frame Williams as masculine and superhuman, and frequently contrast her with the white femininity of athletes such as Maria Sharapova or Anna Kournikova. Kournikova reportedly once declared, quote, "I hate my muscles. I'm not Venus Williams. I'm not Serena Williams. I'm feminine. I don't want to look like they do. I'm not masculine like they are," end quote. Kournikova's hatred of her own muscles becomes a point of contrast with the Williams sisters. The contrast between Rousey and Williams in particular demonstrates that Black women perform different athletic labor of femininity as they face racist discourses that perpetually contrast them with idealized forms of white femininity. Black UFC fighter Angela Hill describes her own experience in the media spotlight in similar terms to Williams. She says that the UFC and potential sponsors are looking for the, quote, all-American look. When I asked her to describe what she meant by all-American, she elaborates, "Just the girl next door look. Light skin, long hair, blonde a lot of times, something 90210, something that's not too scary to look at, something that's familiar to the majority of media that you're fed by TV shows and movies," end quote. Hill identifies the ways that all-American and girl next door are coded as white in mainstream media. She contends further that as a Black woman who has natural short hair and is muscular, it's often difficult for white audiences to galvanize around her as fans. She then compares her own experience with Williams. She says, "It's crazy to think that someone like Williams, who has broken so many boundaries, is still having the same issues as someone like me, who hasn't done much yet. I feel like there's always been a struggle. That's always been a struggle in sports. And I feel like that Black women in general, we're such an odd thing to look at for a lot of people when it comes to athletics, because a lot of female athletes are promoted based on their sex appeal." So Hill must not only determine how she'll perform the athletic labor of femininity, but she also has to be mindful about how white audiences will read her and take that into account in her self-branding online. Additionally, while media culture praises Rousey for her work ethic in crafting her muscular athletic body, it often accuses Black sportswomen of having natural muscularity and physical skill. Hill explains, "I feel like there's always been this subconscious feeling that Black athletes have the advantage. So when they win, it's not a big deal. I would see that a lot with women like Serena Williams. You would see her beat these women in tennis, and then they're like, well, look at her. There's a lot more to tennis than size and strength." The labor of being an exceptional athlete then often goes unrecognized in Black female athletes. And instead, racist scripts explain that labor away as a natural phenomenon devoid of discipline and hard work. The athletic labor of femininity requires additional racialized work from Black sportswomen like Hill in the UFC, because they must work to make themselves less threatening and more palatable for white audiences in order to receive endorsements. And when I'm talking about this, I'm talking about the sort of the big marquee endorsements, because there is a lot of things that micro-influencers can do to receive more attention from more niche audiences, which I'll talk about in a second. Athletes like Hill are astute in their assessment of these realities of their professions and must learn to carefully craft their social media accounts with these realities in mind. As Hill points out, while white female athletes can more readily flaunt their muscularity, and it can be read as figures of women's empowerment compared to Black female athletes, particularly those with natural hair, dark skin, and other visual signifiers of difference. So now I'm going to switch over and talk about Michelle Waterson. Waterson was not someone I interviewed, but I did read a lot of interviews where she talks about herself, how she presents herself, and basically how she ultimately brands herself online. She is a mixed race Asian American UFC fighter who has gone by the name Karate Hottie throughout her MMA career. She's a compelling figure in MMA media because she is sometimes distinctly coded as Asian and other times read as emblematic of post-race discourses that circulate around mixed bodies. As Jessica Chen and David Andrews note about Waterson's self-presentation online and through various MMA media sites' descriptions of the fighter, she often walks an ambivalent race and gendered line between the dragon lady and the lotus flower stereotypes in Western representations of ethnically Asian women. Chen and Andrews show how her nickname emphasizes her Asianness in karate and her sexual availability and desirability in hottie to perpetuate a, quote, historical narrative of Asian American women as mysterious, beautiful objects of desire. While white female athletes who perform femininity must work to maintain a balance between pretty and powerful, Waterson must also navigate particular Orientalist tropes of her Asian femininity. Waterson views her participation in the karate hottie image as, quote, playing the game. She says, quote, if that's going to get me in the door so that people can actually see how skilled I am as an athlete, that's fine, I'll play the game. And I think this is really common for a lot of sports women who end up playing that game because they understand exactly what they're doing, but they also understand in order to get what they want in life that oftentimes that's the game that they have to play. Waterson is a savvy self-promoter on social media and understands that branded difference in the UFC creates value for her as a mother and Asian woman. The UFC loves me. They know I can bring what I can bring to the UFC as far as bringing different types of people into the arena. I'm a mother, I have Asian descent. So all of these things that people outside of the general MMA audience would want to come watch. I think the UFC sees that, and they're going to be putting more effort into working me up. Waterson shows that as a mother and an Asian woman, she can reach different audience demographics than the UFC might otherwise be able to access. Thus, her propensity to emphasize these traits stems from an understanding that these identity categories are appealing to the UFC decision makers because they believe that it will connect with new audiences via branded difference. Waterson's mixed race identity also becomes a marketable trait for the promotion that requires her to navigate discourses of femininity in post-race in particular ways. As ESPN's Katie Barnes notes, Waterson is a, quote, approachable, playful, and as an added bonus, she's biracial, breaking the model of the blonde female UFC star, end quote. Barnes views her biracial identity as an asset for the promotion in similar ways that Waterson has also discussed her race as marketable. Waterson's mother is Thai and her father is white American, and she's married to a Latinx man, and her daughter is multiracial. While Waterson may be read more dominantly by fans in MMA media as Asian, her biracial identity and mixed race family are used in examining Waterson as an Instagram darling and a UFC star. As Leilani Nishime writes in Undercover Asian, quote, the liberal democratic racial project promotes a disembodied and discontextualized version of race. It neatly neutralizes the possible disruptive power of presenting a racially ambiguous figure, end quote. Although Waterson is sometimes coded as monoracially Asian and she can represent colorblind discourses that permit malleability in her image, in UFC promotional media, she can stand as palatable evidence of the UFC's inclusivity of diverse female fighters while supporting the post-racial surmounting of race that mixed race bodies are presumed to achieve. All right, I'm going to play you a little bit of a promotional spot on Michelle Waterson called Making of the Mom Champ. Waterson said maybe a couple of years ago that she wanted to be the first UFC champ that was also a mother. And so she hashtagged herself Mom Champ. And I'll play a little bit of this for you.
My name is Michelle Waterson, and I fight for the strawweight division in the UFC. Fighting for the UFC has definitely been something of a surreal journey, because when I first started fighting, Dana White was still talking about there's no way that women see the light of day in the octagon. So we've come a really long way, and I'm very fortunate to be able to say that I've been through it all. I want to be Mom Champ for myself, but I know that in doing that, I will be showing my daughter what it is to go after your dreams, and I'm a strong believer that our children learn the most through our actions. Oh, good job.
That was good.
My name is Joshua Gomez, and I am Michelle Waterson's husband. So when I first met Michelle, I remember after a couple of dates noticing some bruises on her. And finally, she opened up. She told me that she trained in mixed martial arts, and then I let her know that I boxed, and it was kind of just kind of meant to be after that.
When Araya came along, instead of allowing me to give up on my dreams, he gave up on his dreams of becoming a world champion boxer. There were so many times that I wanted to just give it all up, and he is actually the one that would sit me down and say, "You're not quitting. I'll take care of it. I'll go to work, and you're going to continue to train because I know that you are going to be a world champion one day."
These are very cool, obviously, right?
All right. So Making of Mom Champ emphasizes how Waterson navigates her relatable roles as mother and wife while being a professional fighter. And her racial identity is never discussed explicitly, but her mixed race family features prominently as visual evidence of branded difference. Relina Joseph. So I obviously had to get Relina and Leilani in this talk. So I chose the chapter that, of course, that features them most prominently. So I'm always a grad student. Relina Joseph describes post-racial discourses of racialized women as an ambivalent dance between the post-identity every woman who embodies a universal appeal because of her positioning as a liberal, democratic, colorblind subject, and more racially specific subject that represents as niche desirability. Waterson can be marketed as the every woman or as the Asian woman, depending on the goals of any particular promotional effort, which speaks to branded differences' tendency to waltz between difference and sameness when promoting fighters. Regardless of whether Waterson is coded as Asian or being beyond race at any given moment, at the point that her athletic labor of femininity is always simultaneously performing racialized labor. So now I want to talk a little bit about how fighters negotiate this, because it's not necessarily, they don't just accept it passively that the athletic labor of femininity that's also a racialized discourse is something that they're going to have to do. They decide how they're going to do it. They decide how they're going to negotiate the pressures that they feel. So many female fighters feel pressure to invest in labor and curating a presence online that deploys particular brands of femininity like Waterson, but many of them feel inauthentic to their own personal brands if they do. Angela Hill explains that a lot of female athletes feel pressured to post content that appeals to a straight male gaze. She says, "I know a lot of girls feel pressure to post sexy pictures to keep their names in people's mouths. That's the kind of line that a lot of female athletes have to walk. They have to be able to do both. They have to be able to be monsters in the cage, but also look cute and pretty outside the cage. And I'm not against that. I feel like I do a pretty good job of doing both, but it's annoying that the guys don't have to do that. The guys can just be themselves, just be athletes. They don't have to take pictures in their underwear to promote themselves." Hill illustrates the ways that women in the promotion negotiate how to authentically brand themselves when many of them can't or won't perform the same athletic labor of femininity online as a Rousey or a Paige Van Zandt. However, social media allows for customization and for connecting with consumers that might be interested in an athlete's personal brand, even if that athlete falls somewhere in the middle or lower tiers of what's considered marketable. And the UFC really is interested in not only really large markets, that's where they invest most of their efforts, but if a fighter can develop a niche following, then that's something that they view as favorable. Angela Hill and Roxanne Modafferi share some similarities in how they brand themselves on social media, yet differ on their willingness to post sexy content. Both athletes have roughly 80,000 followers on Instagram, a fraction of Van Zandt's followings, and describe themselves as quote unquote nerdy. Hill explains her personal brand. I think the Angela Hill brand is kind of quirky. It's smart and it's seated in a bit of pop culture. I do a lot of stuff with video games and with art. Before I got back into the UFC, one of my big things was doing cosplay. But aside from that, I've always tried to take the witty side of things. I've always tried to live tweet fight nights and stuff like that. The funnier the comments that I make during the fight, the more successful I felt I was being towards what I was trying to represent. So I've always tried to be funny in a smart way. So when I do something sexy, it isn't just sexy. I try to keep it fun and something that you would laugh at when you see it, like saying something silly in the caption or make fun of the fact that I'm doing it. So I think what I want to show when I do stuff is that I'm very aware of what I'm doing and I'm not afraid to be who I am, to show the nerdy artsy side of myself. Hill emphasizes a playfulness and lightness in her self-presentation and shows that she's comfortable with sexy in a way that doesn't take herself too seriously. Roxanne Modafferi shares some similarities in her nerdy self-presentation, but she differs in her willingness to portray the sexy female fighter. Modafferi says, I tend to post pictures of what I enjoy doing, like jiu-jitsu or Japanese anime. I also post sponsor stuff. I don't tend to post glamour shots of me scantily clad. I posted one picture of my butt and spats, and that got like 2,000 likes. Sex sells, and that sucks for me. I'm shy, and I don't want to do that. But I do stay true to myself and notice that my fans are hardcore. They'll never turn on me. I know that I have good quality fans who like my butt, but it's not the most important feature, and you can quote me on that. Modafferi points to an athlete's ability to find a supportive and niche following on social media. She doesn't have as many followers as Van Zandt or Rousey, and probably makes a fraction in sponsorship dollars, and hasn't had the same level of mainstream media appearances. There is a niche market for the types of content that Modafferi promotes, even without selling sex. However, I would venture that building a niche audience and connecting with a particular brand of followers may now be possible through social media, but it does require additional labor. Creating an audience without using the bikini pictures method, as Roxy calls it, requires a trial and error labor on the part of sportswomen to see what might entice a group of followers that better reflects that fighter's personal brand. Customization and the curation of a particular audience is possible, but it requires considerable effort. The experience of fighters like Hill and Modafferi show us that there is a market for online personalities that fall outside the sexy sportswoman motif, even though they attract a smaller share of the market. And of course, it also shows us that even racialized women have different ways that they can develop niche followings, even if they don't fit the stereotypes that are the most marketable. Social media sites like Instagram have developed a business model that allows for people to craft distinct identities online and develop sponsor relationships that share affinities with those identities. Marketing professionals now consider micro-influencers more valuable to brands because they cater to extremely defined groups of customers. They are cheaper, and followers are more likely to believe that Angela Hill actually uses a product she endorses than a Kim Kardashian. What the world of influencers and micro-celebrities teaches us is that there is money to be made for brands who attach themselves to all sorts of people laboring for visibility online. Branded Difference, at its core, understands that different types of content attracts various UFC fan demographics, so they need multiple on-ramps for engagement. Yet, much of the content fighters post on social media accounts is a form of aspirational labor that circulates the UFC name and connects the promotion with niche audiences that follow particular fighters without necessarily paying that fighter financially or in terms of securing fight contracts. Since UFC fighters are independent contractors, the brand doesn't have to pay them to tweet. So the labor fighters perform is free. The only cost to the UFC are the data analytics that they run on fighter social media accounts and the occasional bonus that they pay out for engagement online. Thus, the UFC uses many of the logics of influencer marketing to promote its brand, but it doesn't directly pay the athletes to do that work. So one thing that I don't have time for today that is another component of this chapter is the emotional labor of interacting with fans online. And that is also a gendered and racialized labor. So for example, an Amnesty International study on violence against women and Twitter found that women of color were 34% more likely to receive harassing comments than white women. And Black women were a staggering 84% more likely to experience abuse online. So Angela Hill talks about this misogynoir and how shocked she was the more visible she became in UFC media of how much of this she was experiencing. And this is something that she says, it's disheartening when I looked at YouTube comments about me because I thought people would embrace the fact that I was the first Black American woman in the UFC. And the UFC has billed her. Recently, she headlined a fight and she was billed as the first Black woman to headline a UFC card. So there's this celebratory discourse of she's the first Black woman to do this. And she thought she was going to have, this was going to be a big thing, but she has to deal with the emotional labor again of dealing with fans online. And she said people were basically like, who is this girl? We want to see Paige Van Zandt. So social media visibility requires sportswomen to negotiate the athletic labor of femininity by embracing, tailoring, or rejecting it, while opening themselves up to public scrutiny and harassment that they, rather than their publicist or manager, because they can't afford to have somebody do it for them, must navigate. The female fighters I analyzed here reveal that fielding racist and sexist comments from fans emboldened by the screen barrier between them and the fighters is emotionally laborious. And some of the comments that I have in the chapter that I wasn't able to go over are just really, it's really horrible. I mean, anytime you start digging into harassment online, it's a pretty terrible space to be in. The actual labor these sportswomen undertake is a consequence of the risk economy that facilitates aspirational labor online to hopefully gain what visibility promises to offer: more fights, increased sponsorship, and greater job security. All the while, the business practice of using influencers to curry favor for larger companies and corporations mean that these workers may never actually see the fruits of that labor in tangible terms. All right, so that's the end of that chapter. And as I was prepping this today, I thought, I probably should have described the chapter arc somewhere in the beginning when I was giving the book overview, but of course, time gets away from you and best laid plans, and then you end up putting it at the end. So I'll tell you about that now. So the way I've organized this book is that it starts with an organizational context. So developing a millennial sports media brand, and really tries to understand the how and why female fighters came along in the UFC at the particular time from a more media industry's perspective. Then I moved to the representational and the discursive. So what are the sparkling discourses that really make female fighters shine in the UFC? And I talk about popular feminism and empowerment discourses. And then I also talk about gendering the American dream and how female fighters are folded into this American dream discourse that's common when talking about combat sports like boxing and things like that. And then the last two chapters are the chapter that I presented for you today on the labor of social media, or labor of visibility on social media. And then I also have the last chapter thinks about efforts to organize fighters, because there's a lot of evidence that they are misclassified as independent contractors and it actually should be classified as employees. And there's been several fighters who have tried to organize the rest of the fighters to advocate on behalf of themselves and create a union. And so I profile Leslie Smith, who's been a big advocate around the unionization of fighters. And unions, what we know of unions is they benefit women and people of color the most. So I think this is one of the really most viable options for creating more equity in the UFC. So the UFC's branding of difference is an ambivalent cultural discourse that elevates minoritized genders, races, ethnicities, sexualities, and nationalities in order to grow the visibility of the brand with diverse and global audiences. And I didn't even talk about how global the UFC's audience is, but they have a wide reach. The initial success of the UFC's women's divisions might seem to suggest that the UFC's efforts to incorporate female fighters into their brands is a promising tactic for increasing the visibility of women in sports. Representation matters, and promoting fan identification with diverse audiences appears to achieve what feminist sports scholars and activists have been advocating for decades: meaningful engagement with diverse female athletes. In this book, we see how a lesbian Marine, an Iraqi refugee, and a Navajo champion, and an empowered white heroine all have degrees of luminosity within the UFC. However, the surface level celebration of difference bolsters an untenable labor model. The spectacle of difference masks the disparities that minoritized fighters face within the organization around issues of labor and exploitation in particular. Diverse women in the UFC are exploited for the difference they represent. They receive low pay, minimal benefits, and ensure contracts that benefit the UFC to a greater degree than the fighters. The UFC's branding strategies reveal that positive, accurate, or meaningful representation is a fraught endeavor without fair working conditions. The state of affairs instead means that analysts and fans of women's sports must now grapple with what happens to sportswomen when they become celebrated and exploited in sports media. Fighting visibility throws the first punch. Ooh, and I got it in 45 minutes, just like I planned.
Yay!
Yay! Thank you. I want to stop
Awesome.
share and go to gallery view so I can see all your beautiful faces. There you are.
Awesome, amazing, and Jen, you probably couldn't see it, but the chat was blowing up.
I saw that it was blowing up, but I couldn't look at it.
which is appropriate. But I think we will have a spirited conversation afterwards, and I feel very privileged I get to start us off. And so I have two questions for you, and one is a content question for the book, and the other one is kind of a process question that particularly for grad students, I think they might be interested in. Which one do you want me to start with?
Whatever you want.
Either one? Okay. So I'm thinking about today is Trans Day of Visibility. And I'm not sure, because I haven't gotten the book yet. It's not in my hot little hands. So I'm not sure what actually, which of your case studies made it into the book from the disc. So I'd love to hear you talk a bit about trans fighters in particular, MMA fighters, perhaps, if they didn't kind of make it in, and the experience of branded different in particular with transgender fighters.
Great question. I'm so glad you talked about that today. So I didn't end up including my work on Fallon Fox in this book because I focused only on the UFC, and she was excluded from the UFC. So I do mention it when I talk about sort of, they have this ambivalence with how they promote diversity, and in a lot of ways, because they're like, yeah, you're all diversity, and then they're hyper sexist, hyper racist, and transphobic all at the same time. So it's all thrown in there together in how they treat difference. So with Fallon Fox in particular, I think when we think about trans visibility is also a very fraught visibility. And Mia Fisher has this great book called Terrorizing Gender, where she thinks about surveillance and the visibility of trans bodies and talks about how we presume in society that more visibility is a good thing, but actually there's evidence that more visibility actually puts the target on trans women. And when you think about, or trans people in general, but especially trans women when we're talking about sports. And so if you think about all of this discourse right now, where people are using trans women as reasons to not create equity in women's sports, and saying that they don't want to pass the Equality Act, because then it means that trans women and trans girls can compete with cis girls and cis women. And so trans people are hyper visible within that discourse, but that isn't to their benefit. It's benefiting people who want to use fear mongering and transphobia to prevent change in society, which is a horrible way to use trans folks. And the discourse right now is really quite sickening. And even the fighter that I profiled in my dissertation, Fallon Fox, she hasn't fought in like 7 years, but she's come up in the media again because people with this discourse right now are using her as an excuse to say this trans woman broke the skull of a cis woman in a fight. And the reality is that did happen, but it happens. It's a very common occurrence. Like people break bones all the time. People break facial bones all the time. So it's not uncommon. And I actually see Mia Fisher is here. Mia, I didn't know you were here. So I just plugged your book. but yeah.
Excellent. Thank you. Thank you so much for that thoughtful response. I think it's on a lot of our minds right now. So my other question is thinking about especially for our grad students who are present. So you only just graduated in 2017, and this book is already out. So really, I mean, super fast, Jen, like really, really fast from dissertation to book manuscript and actually completely out. I hope if your department's here, I hope they're putting you up for early tenure if you want early tenure, because hello. So maybe you can talk a little bit about this process. And I mean, from this end, I'm like, it seems easy. I know none of it feels easy, but maybe talk a little bit about it for us, and any advice that you would give graduate students in particular, perhaps as they're writing their dissertations and thinking about these are going to be books, what should I do in the process?
Yeah, great questions. So I did not have a tenure track job when I graduated. I had a visiting lecturer job. So the first sort of systemic issue or structural issue was I needed to get a job. And I knew having a book contract was going to make me more marketable to different departments. And so I really had a fire because I was, wanting to be in a tenure track position. And so I was very motivated. I think there is some merit and some logic if you're not in that position to take a breather afterwards and let your dissertation sort of marinate before you move on. So there's nothing wrong with that strategy. But if you're not in the position where you can do that, what I did was I took the summer off and I didn't start thinking about the book proposal until the fall. And backing up from that, I had already started meeting with acquisition editors and series editors back before my dissertation was finished, which is something that I think is important. And sometimes a couple of people sought me out. I didn't know this was a thing where they would contact you while you were still doing your dissertation. I had to write Rolina and be like, is this a thing? Are they supposed to be reaching out to me right now? And the relationships I formed with a particular set of people at Illinois, they were really supportive. They got what the dissertation was doing. They understood where I wanted to go with the book. And so I already had that relationship developed and I knew where I wanted it to go. And then I also hired a developmental editor, which was really valuable because I had a committee to help me through the dissertation and tell me what the dissertation should look like. And then suddenly I didn't really have a lot of people. I mean, of course I still have Arlena, but I didn't have the same structure in place to help me with that. So hiring a developmental editor was really very helpful. And she helped me with both the process of doing the book proposal, and then she helped me with an early draft of the book. And I think those things are really key if you're in a position where you can afford it. And my developmental editor is actually coming up. She's publishing a book in June or July, I guess, on developing a book proposal. And so even if you can't afford, depending on what position you're in after you graduate, if you can't afford to hire somebody, I was lucky enough to have research funding for it. But if you can't afford to hire somebody, at least you can get those resources. And then also develop a network of people who are, know about book writing. I'm lucky to be in a department where I can go and talk to a lot of different people because a lot of people have written books and I can give their insights. And I think, one of the things I learned at UW was how important community was. And so having groups like the CDRG is really important. And then figuring out how to create that for yourself once you get out is also really important. I think you had another question in that I may not have answered, but.
You did great. No, that was wonderful. I think that's all really great substantive advice for people as they're thinking about moving forward. And the community building, you were an amazing community builder when you're here, and thinking about how do you create that as you move on is tremendous. So
Also,
people,
I'm posting a link, 1 second, I'm posting a link that
Yeah.
my developmental editor did a Q&A with me about the book writing process.
Nice.
So I posted a link. So if any of you are interested in,
Wonderful.
going from this to book, we talk about it.
And Megan will capture, she's a pro at this. Megan will capture all this. So if you're feeling a little overwhelmed by the chat and you can't capture every,
Yeah, I haven't seen everything.
Megan's gonna make sure that she captures all these wonderful links to move
Mhm.
forward. Developmental editors are huge. I've had the same one on all 3 of my books, and so we've been able to also have a conversation about where my writing has been. And you don't have that after you graduate, oftentimes in that level of specificity. So I love that advice too. So let's get to some questions from our audience, please. Go ahead, raise your hand, put your question in the chat. I know that some people were embedding their questions all the way through, but I'd appreciate it if you put your questions again, enter it into the chat. That would be really helpful to get us started, please.
So Nick, I'm going to spotlight you.
Yeah, I'm sorry. My question isn't going to be very interesting. I think you already addressed it, but I was a little bit late. I was wondering why, for you personally, this was something you were interested in writing about.
Mm-hmm. So I have trained Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu for several years, and I've trained martial arts for 15 total. So I started out when I was a student, a grad student here at UW. A lot of my friends watched the UFC, and I never wanted to. I was never really interested in it, and I didn't come to grad school to become a sports scholar, and I would never have guessed that that would be the direction that I went. But research takes you in directions that you wouldn't know. And when I wrote the dissertation, I didn't know the book was going to become about labor either. So there's ways that you learn and you grow as you move along in a project, and you find things that you wouldn't expect. And, I wouldn't have expected to learn all about, independent contracting and, things like that.
Thanks, Nick.
Thank you. So I see a quote. Oh, do you have a follow-up there, Nick? But while you're still spotlit? No, you're good? Okay. I see a question here in the chat from Suhani. I'm happy to read your question, but you can also ask it yourself if you want to ask it in your own voice. You could jump off. I'll pause for a second.
Yeah, I can ask it.
Go ahead.
Yeah, I would just love to know more. I think you mentioned it briefly, but how are BIPOC women fighters portrayed by media when they're fighting white women fighters? I know specifically you talked about Black women fighters facing more prejudice and stereotypes. So yeah, how does that get leveraged in this situation?
So I think things have developed quite a bit over the years. There was a fighter named Chris Cyborg who fought a sort of very stereotypically feminine, but yet also muscular white fighter named Gina Carano. This was pre-UFC, and they billed it as the beauty versus the beast. And you could probably imagine which one was labeled as what. I would say the UFC now isn't so egregious, and sort of, they wouldn't market it that way because they do have a lens towards trying to represent people not in so cringeworthy ways, but it doesn't mean that they don't do it, that they do that perfectly. Because what you'll see on the screen might not be so egregious, but what you read in the comments, or you hear UFC fighters talking about, or you hear about the president of the organization talking about, he's been very misogynistic and racist towards Chris Cyborg, the fighter that I was talking about, was labeled as the beast, and she got kicked out of the UFC. And so it's not so much I don't see it as much in the representation of the actual fights or the actual really highly curated promotional efforts. Where I really see it coming out is in how they treat them online spaces, and then also off the cuff when it's not so curated, because there's this desire to look like they're open for everybody and they have something for everyone. So they sort of understand that you can't be so blatantly, overtly racist or misogynistic. But, we know how the function of more covert forms of racism, obviously, are very, very much prevalent in how they engage with fighters.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
Excellent. So I'm going to skip over questions that feel redundant if people have if Jen's already answered them. But Trevor, do you want to ask your question yourself? Do you want me to ask Jen?
Yeah, I'll ask my question.
Okay.
So what I really wanted to know is how can we use media and storytelling to start changing the narrative around women fighters? So in comics, movies, video games, anything really. How do we start creating stories that begin to change narratives in conjunction with things like mutual aid and support and uplifting marginalized voices?
Mm-hmm. I mean, that's a great question. I would like to see more media that really covers the underbelly of what the actual fighters' experiences are, because I think that there's this way that fighters get trapped in this American dream discourse. And this is true for male fighters and for female fighters, but they get trapped in this American dream discourse that fighting is hard and being an independent contractor is hard, but it's all a part of pulling yourself up from your bootstraps and striving for the American dream. And fighters are actually very, a lot of them, I had a hard time getting interviews with because they don't want to do anything that might jeopardize their position within the promotion. And so I think that there needs to be more awareness around things like that, like the understanding not just the glossy representation, because I think there is room to improve that too, because we're not there with sportswomen. We know that sportswomen are vastly underrepresented in society or in media culture. But it's still, these structural things that are used that aren't as visible to people, I think are the things that we need to make aware of. So the media we create needs to be more fair-handed about the exploitation that large institutions, exact on their female athletes. And you could do a project like you could look at the NCAA, for example, and look at how women are starting to become more visible, women's basketball, for example, this March Madness, even though the women are not allowed to call it March Madness because of branding, it's only for the men's tournament. And we've seen that there are gross inequalities in their training facilities. And the media has been able to bring that to light. And the women are actually gaining more media exposure, more people are watching than have ever before. It's like blowing the roof off. But we know they're also exploited as collegiate, workers who labor for these institutions. They're making a lot of money. So I want to see broader culture more aware of this, because it's easier to look at the representation and judge it as good or bad, but it's much harder to look below the surface of it and say, okay, but what is it actually doing?
Thank you. Thank you, Jen.
Thank you.
I think next we have Michelle Sturgis, who has a question for you.
I was gonna, can you hear me? Hi, Dr. McClearen, it's so good to see you.
It's so good to see you.
It's crazy to think that when you were finishing your graduate program, I was starting mine and I saw you as an instructor and just thought that was so cool. And today I'm here with my students for the class that I'm teaching. So the question that I have, actually the first question, Dr. Joseph already asked that. And what I appreciate about your presentation is the mention of Serena Williams, because on Monday, I started class with Beyonce's I Ain't Sorry music video, which features Serena Williams. And I wonder, what kind of branding was taking place in that moment of appearing in Beyonce's music video, and the way that she was dressed and her dancing and all of that. And so the class is about mixing up race, gender, and sexuality. And I think this presentation did exactly that. You show us the nuances within femininity, specifically through this lens of UFC. And I do remember a student in particular kind of mentioning or questioning the femininity that we see athletes like ballerinas and gymnasts, and how, so really when you kind of consider that, there's this whole spectrum of femininity that's available to us. And then Dr. Joseph's question was kind of asking, well, what about, in addition to femininity and masculinity, is there space for other representations? So that really fits in well with our class. But so my question is actually about the kind of current moment, which maybe it's the terrible COVID question, but I am curious how UFC has responded to the pandemic. And I'm also curious about the ways in which the women athletes that you study, if they've used their online branding as a way to communicate a certain politics around things like vaccinations or masking up, how you've seen that kind of play out.
Mm-hmm. So the UFC in the pandemic, UFC was one of the first organizations back, and they took it upon themselves to, to be the first, because they didn't really want COVID to stop them. Part of this, a huge part of this is obviously business related, because they're owned mostly by a company named Endeavor, which has holdings in things like tourism and hospitality and things like that. So of course they took a huge hit, which made their the UFC be really important. And that has been the lifeline for them. And that has been the thing that's made the most money for them. And so they came back, and they had fighters that were reluctant and didn't want to fight, but they had enough, because you have all these independent contractors that don't fight enough and they don't get paid enough money. They don't really have a lot of options. So you can find fighters that are willing to fight. And so I think the first one back was like maybe late March, early April of 2020. So it was really fast. And they're having like a full coming up. They have a card in Florida that is, they're allowing fans back in, because they did remove fans for a while. And now they have a full capacity crowd that's supposed to be the biggest crowd ever. And we're not all vaccinated. So their COVID politics are terrible, because the bottom dollar is the number one. And just because they have all of this rhetoric of including all of these people, it's just like a way to make more money, because when you see diverse fighters represented, you get excited because somebody looks like you. And so they know that can make them money. And in terms of the politics, I haven't seen, there's a wide range of fighters. They don't fall on any particular political spectrum. You'll see everything represented. And none of them that I recall really came out and said anything against the UFC coming back early. They might have, but it wasn't very visible, because they're very tentative. They do not like to speak badly about the UFC. So they're not going to go against the status quo, because, they're so precarious. So I wouldn't say that the politics around, masking and things I haven't really seen a lot, but I don't follow everybody. I'm sure there's somebody out there, but I haven't seen a big push for it. I think a lot of them really try to stay out of politics, honestly, because again, they fear for their jobs and they just want to do their job. So yeah, it's interesting.
Thank you for answering that. And what I really enjoyed about your talk is the way you focus on, you look to the money, as they say it, and really sticking close to the media industry and kind of what, even though it's individuals who are putting this out there, it's kind of coming from UFC, as you're explaining, or it's really driven by this sort of labor logic. So thank you for that. And just a quick plug to my students real quick, that right after this, we're going to be meeting in our classroom. And that's for those of you that were not in class on Monday. But if you were in class on Monday, you are good to go after this. Thank you.
Thank you for coming and bringing your class.
All right. Oh, how about Angela Babina? Do you want to come and ask your question here?
Yeah, sure. Thanks for giving the talk. It was really interesting. I just wanted to ask a question kind of about how the male fighters are sort of, how do they fit into this whole discussion? Have they been supportive of their female, coworkers? Are they contributing to it at all? Are they part of the problem? What have you kind of seen in your research of how do they fit into this?
Well, like I was saying earlier, you see a whole range. You see fighters who are misogynistic and they will say things that disparage female fighters. You'll see other ones that are supportive, and are anti-racist in their discourse, and you see a range. And I would say too, I'm focusing a lot on women, because that's the subject of the book, but, male fighters are also experiencing labor disparities too, because it's not as drastic as the women because of all the sort of cultural gendered issues that devalue women in particular and devalue women of color even more than white women. But they're also, they're also experiencing fearing for their jobs. They're also experiencing, the status of independent contracting and thinking about how they're going to make money. And so there is a certain level of camaraderie. And I would also say that in some gyms more than others, you have a lot of mixed training among men and women, which brings about some interesting things in terms of community and support within those teams, which is interesting. I think for a sport that is not co-ed, there is a capacity to have at least some camaraderie with your teammates when you're training, in a particular area. So I would say it was a mixed bag. I would say you could see a full spectrum of things. Mm-hmm. Thank you.
Awesome. Let's see if we can get some speed round questions. I'm trying. There's so many questions here. Let's see. Jackson, you want to ask your question, please, of Dr. McClearen?
Yeah, I can do that. My question, I'll just read it off, is have there been any individual fighters who have publicly pushed back against either the notion of playing into the game or just like the fact that there are these discriminatory practices within the UFC? Or does the fact that they're coming at this notion from a critical standpoint guarantee that they won't see success?
Yeah, I mean, I feel like in the book, there's people that push back, and that the interviewees that I talked to that they really, like, some of them did push back and say that they didn't want to do that, and they wouldn't do certain things on social media. And so I didn't detail those there just because of time, or during the talk because of time, but there is like some people that actively resist it and say that they won't do it. As far as being critical, again, there's a lot of fear, so they won't be so publicly critical, and then they also won't tell somebody who's going to put that in the book what they really think, because they don't want that to be out there and visible for the public. So, it is hard to get like what they really think in a lot of ways. One of the best interviewees that I had was a retired UFC fighter named Julie Kedzie. And she has a brilliant critique, and she really pushes back against a lot of those issues. But again, she's not employed by the UFC anymore, so she can be, and she's okay with putting herself out there like that. So I would say that, and what I hope you saw from the talk is that they know this is happening. Like, and you have to decide, if you're familiar with Stuart Hall's encoding, decoding, you have to decide how once you're critically aware, are you negotiating, how you're interpreting, what's going on in society? Are you sort of giving into it, or are you actively resisting it? And I think that they run the gamut of that, but they're not, the ones that have been really vocal, like Leslie Smith, for example, was really vocal about unionizing. She no longer works for the UFC. Chris Cyborg was really vocal about how she was treated. She no longer works for the UFC. So having those examples strikes fear in the fighters because they don't want to go that route of Leslie Smith or Chris Cyborg. So it's a really powerful, when you have a bunch of independent contractors, it's a really powerful way to, maintain the status quo because they don't have any power to push against it. And that's why Leslie Smith really wanted to unionize, to give the fighters agency and have some decision-making power and have ways to advocate for more revenue share. Those are great questions. Thank you.
Yeah. It's looking at it. I mean, this question is like looking at absence, which was one of the things that we talked about presence and absence. And what do you read there? I think that we're going to give our possibly our last question. Connie, you have such a great question here that seems like a great going out of a talk question. Do you want to unmute yourself and ask this question?
Sure. Hi, Jen.
Hi.
Thank you for your speech. It was so inspiring. I had the question of what was one thing that you didn't realize before you write the book, but enlightened you afterwards?
There's so many things. Well, I think about the book in two phases, right? Because the book was a dissertation, which is a different document than a book. And I think I've already mentioned that I didn't know that the book was going to be about visibility. And I didn't know that the book was going to be about labor when I wrote the dissertation. And so it was only through kind of sort of keep working at it that I sort of came to these things. And, I worked on this for 7 years. So it took a while to get there with the arguments, and it took a while to get there with what I was really finding. Another thing I'll say for around the question of what it is like to turn the dissertation into the book, it's like I kept all the research from the dissertation, but I totally mixed it up and put it into a different argument that became the book. And then I had to do some additional research because of that newness. I had to do some additional research on top of that in order to make it a full rounded book. So the last 2 chapters, for example, were not found in my dissertation. And in the first, several chapters in the introduction, elements were found in the dissertation, but it was really packaged very differently.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.
And I love that remixing metaphor there, Jen. I think that's one of the amazing things. And it's funny because it's like, oh, I worked on it for 7 years. I think that for a lot of folks are like, that seems impossible. And then other people who worked on books have been like, I've been working on this thing for 10, 15 years and I haven't been able to get it out. So honestly, truly, this is for people who have not written books. Jen did this really fast. This is really, really fast. I think maybe we have time for one more quick question. Let's see. Abigail, Kim, do you want to ask your question really quickly?
Hi, thank you for the presentation today. Your book was super interesting, especially about how like that viewpoint that people have towards women athletes of color versus white women athletes. So that made me think about how, so for these athletes that do try to fit into these like straight male gaze images that help them get more popular, how do like the public and maybe their marketing teams react when these athletes are trying to move away from that image? For example, when you were talking about the mom warrior, and also how the public response is to those female athletes who don't really fit into that straight white male gaze image.
Mm-hmm. So I think in terms of, they don't have marketing teams because they're independent contractors and they don't make very much money. They can't afford really to have their own marketing teams. They do have managers, and their managers will tell them some will tell them, this is what you need in order to market yourself. A lot of them are just really aware of the pressures in society. They know how the media works, and they know they can be critical of the media and know that, if you present yourself in a certain way, you're going to gain more followers, and they can trial and error to see what works. So when Roxy Modafferi was talking about, she posted her butt picture and she got these 2,000 likes when she posts all this other cool stuff. She knows, but I think there's also a push towards authenticity and branding that gets marked into these layers of, I theorize as layers, hierarchies of visibility, right? So if you have, 20,000 followers on Instagram versus 1 million followers on Instagram, there's a degree of visibility that you have. And the more you can cater towards that, that ideal, the more followers you'll have, or the more like sort of interesting way that you can market yourself that's like different even, you're going to get more followers. But it's really hard to do. It seems easy when you look at Instagram influencers. It seems like they got it down and it was just easy to up and make an account. But there's a lot of work that goes into curating like a successful influencer account. And a lot of that labor doesn't pay off. And so a lot of people try it and it doesn't pay off in the ways that they want it to, but other people try it and it pays off. Like Roxy has like maybe 50,000 followers and she posts really specific content. She posts stuff about jujitsu. She posts stuff about like, she loves Japan. She'll post stuff about that. And she'll post like really goofy, nerdy stuff. And that's what people like that follow her. And I think that the point of all of this is that that's still something that the UFC can profit on, because she's still like hashtagging the UFC. Like she's still like, even though it seems like it seems like peanuts compared to somebody that has like 8 million followers or something like that, like Serena Williams, it really does, end up paying in it to a degree. And they want that level of exposure and they want their fighters to engage in sort of that labor online.
Excellent. Thank you. Thank you so much. And with that, unfortunately, we are at the end of our event time. If you still had a question for Dr. McClearen that you did not get answered, please do. You could ask her over Twitter. Can you say your Twitter handle again?
Sure. It's @JMcClearen. So I'll just type it in real quick.
Perfect.
So you have it.
So people can copy that and their questions. And I know that she will indeed answer you on the Twitters. Thank you so much for coming to our event today. Please do purchase Fighting Visibility from University of Illinois Press or your independent bookseller material. Thank you so much to Megan and Anu and the team for making it happen. And thank you, Dr. McClearen. Wonderful.
Thank you,
wonderful.
Dr. Joseph.
Thank you, Dr.
Thank you,
McClearen.
everyone.